My name is Brenda Dunne, and for 28 years, I served as the laboratory manager of the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, or PAIR, program at Princeton University. I worked with Professor Robert John, who spent 15 years as dean of the School of Engineering. He was an aerospace scientist. He had become interested in looking at human-machine anomalies, and he was able to get funding for it from a colleague of his in the aerospace business, James McDonnell, who was the patriarch of McDonnell Aircraft Company. He felt that it was important from an aerospace point of view to understand this because there were so-called gremlins that were observed sometimes in aircraft under very tense emotional situations. And he thought we needed to understand it. He told Bob, if you set up a program at Princeton, I'll fund it. And then when Bob and I met at a conference where I was giving a talk about my remote viewing work, he told me he was setting up a program, asked me if I'd be interested in working with him, and I said, I sure would. So anyway, that's how we started. This was back in 1979. People came in and always looked surprised to find this in the engineering school.
Recently, its hallowed halls were scandalized by the research of Dr. Robert John, one of Princeton's most senior academics. Dean of the Faculty of Engineering for 15 whole years, what was his crime? The university refuses to comment, as do virtually all John's colleagues. Frontier research into deep space rocketry is what originally made John's name, and the university is proud of his record. But they'd rather forget the other research that created such a scandal. The whole idea of psychic research, for most scientists, is highly questionable, and it's that research, hidden away in a basement, that cost him his job. His crime was to found a laboratory to investigate the extrasensory powers of the human mind.
We had three main portions. One of them was a series of experiments in what we called human-machine anomalies. These were function sort of like coin flipping. You know, if you flip a coin, you have a 50-50 chance of a head or a tail. In these experiments, you had a 50-50 chance of a 1 or a 0, or a ball that bounced to the left or to the right. And people would just try to get more 1s or more 0s, or just let the machine run in a control condition without thinking anything. So the primary variable that we studied in these experiments was human intention. And the intentions were recorded ahead of time, both in a computer file and in a logbook. All of the devices were very carefully calibrated, so we knew that we were dealing with processes that were reliable, that left to themselves would produce a random output. The idea was we would just tell people, try to get the mean high or the mean low. It was a statistical process, but over many hundreds or thousands or indeed millions of binary events, you could get a distribution output, and you could see that the mean of that distribution was ever so slightly shifted, correlated with the intentions that people had determined.
Within a few years, John had run over 250,000 trials, and the results seemed impressive. He had what scientists would normally term highly significant data.
Out of this prodigious database, the results are incontrovertible. There are correlations of the output of these machines with the pre-stated intentions of their operators that far exceed any chance expectations.
A very tiny effect, but over many millions of trials, a highly significant effect that could not occur by chance. Particularly if the mean is going this way when people want it to go that way, and going this way when they want it to go this way, there's no way that you can explain that otherwise. It's also important to point out that when we talk to our participants, they frequently would tell us, you know, there's more to having an intention to make this work. I have to have an emotional connection with the process. I have to feel like the machine is an extension of myself. I have to develop a relationship with the device that is meaningful. It's more than just intention. We realized very early on that although we thought we were studying, or we had set out to study, the effect or the vulnerability of engineering systems, we realized that we were looking at something far more profound. We were looking at how can consciousness, how can non-sensory intention have a tangible and measurable effect on a physical system. The second part of our program was a body of research in remote viewing. There would be two people involved. One would be an agent who would go out to some randomly assigned location somewhere without knowing ahead of time. They'd just get an envelope that would say, go to the da-da-da-da at such and such a time. The other person, who's called the percipient, would be somewhere else, sometimes thousands of miles away. Their task was to try to visualize, try to sense where the agent was located at the assigned time. So we explored probably a couple of dozen different analytical algorithms or recipes. We felt we wanted to get a more quantitative handle on how much information was actually acquired. In the course of that, we generated several hundred trials. And even by any standard, the results came out to be way beyond what chance would predict, what you would get if you were just guessing. If consciousness can acquire information without any sensory input, independently of time or distance, then consciousness is not in the brain. Consciousness somehow is out there, and we are tapping into it. It can't be the brain. In fact, it seems to work best when you turn your brain off. When you're quiet and you stop thinking and stop trying to, where would he be likely to be? What do I know about him? But just shut it down. I sometimes have told people, try imagining you're in a movie theater and there's this dark screen, and at some point a movie is going to come up on that screen and you're going to see it. Don't try to predict what the movie is going to be. Just wait until it starts showing itself. It worked more often than it shouldn't work at all. You know, logically it shouldn't work. The third part of the program was our attempt to try to figure out what was going on, because it was clear that these phenomena could not be explained by any known model or concept. So that was kind of fun.
John was hooked, and he decided to educate himself about the history of psychic research. He found that over the years, the subject had intrigued a handful of other top scientists: mathematician John Taylor, laser physicist Targ Puthoff, Nobel laureate Brian Josephson. Before them, parapsychologist J.B. Rhine had done a whole series of apparently successful experiments. And in the 19th century, some leading British physicists claimed to have proved the reality of psychic powers. But all had failed to convince their fellow scientists. He also found mind over matter was known to some of the founding fathers of science, and indeed that earlier still it was almost a commonplace.
For millennia, there has been an empirical presumption that human desire has something to do with the way the world works. And there was the intriguing possibility that we were actually going to be able to demonstrate that that was true, and demonstrate it on a laboratory bench in an experiment involving incontrovertible electronic equipment, protocols, and data processing.
Of course, there has been criticism of the pair work over the years. There still is, because what we are demonstrating is inconsistent with the prevailing worldview, particularly the prevailing scientific worldview. We have had criticisms that have dealt with the design of our equipment, with the protocols we've used, with the analytical techniques we've used, but we have been very, very careful to make sure that those were not factors.
So when John published his startling results, few scientists took them seriously. Despite his position and his apparently significant data, he was treated like every similar scientist in history. The whole notion of mind over matter was unthinkable heresy.
The criticisms come in a variety of forms, ranging from inadequacy of experimental control, failure of the equipment, improper data processing, improper statistical analysis, self-delusion. The only criticisms we take very seriously are those that appear to be based on some level of information about what we actually do. If a person is unwilling to examine our data and look at the equipment, try the experiments for himself, we really don't spend too much time on the criticism.
There is a saying, I think it was from Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, who said, "I should love my enemy because he brings out the best in me." And because we knew that people were always going to look for some slip-up, some error, we were very, very careful. All of the devices were very carefully calibrated to be sure that they were not subject to any kind of artifact, temperature, vibrations, air pressure, whatever it may be. But most importantly, the experiments we did consisted of very large databases.
The data are very convincing indeed. We have been involved in every stage of the experiment, from the design through the operator producing data to the analysis, and we can therefore know literally that there have not been mistakes made, that there can be no fraudulent activity, and so on. For the data to show that there is an effect, the question becomes, where does it come from? How does it work?
The effect persists despite 12 years of examining and trying to rule out every conventional artifact that we, or for that matter, anybody who communicates with us, has been able to propose. That's a lot of thought and effort gone into ruling out conventional causes.
There was somebody who once said, "This is something I wouldn't believe even if it was true." How do you argue with that logically? You know, okay. There is a big difference between science as a method of learning and scientism, which is a dogma that says we know everything that is necessary to know, and anything that doesn't fit into our model has to be wrong by definition. I am a big fan of the method of science, which I think is a great way to learn and to discover new insights in a particular phenomenon. I am a great enemy of scientism. I've heard that from people who said, "But, you know, if you're right, then I'd be wrong." And I'd say, "No, you'd be incomplete. There's more." The quantum mechanics principles even acknowledge that observation is an important part of the construction of reality.
We are a long way from full understanding of the nature of these phenomena. Our best guess at this point is that under certain circumstances, there is a resonance between the information processor that's in the device and the information processor that we carry in our minds. That somehow, at the level of information, there is a sharing that is accountable for these anomalous effects. That's not overturning all of science, that is expanding it. We are asking for another expansion of the scientific model to accommodate the role of consciousness in the way the world works.
The scientific community, which, by the way, would not even allow the word consciousness when we started in 1979, now accepts that consciousness is important, but their way of going about trying to study it is to look in the brain. They're persuaded that it's something that the brain generates through its neuronal activity and whatnot. They're having fun doing it, but they're not going to find consciousness inside the brain. Consciousness is something much vaster. And I think many of the phenomena such as out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences or precognition indicate that consciousness is not dependent upon the brain, but the brain is dependent upon consciousness. It's as if our brains work sort of like a radio. There's all these frequencies and amplitudes filling this room. But we're not going to pick up on them unless we have a device that we can tune into a particular set of signals, and then we can pick that up. But the program isn't in the radio. The radio is just a transducer of those signals, and that's what I think our brains do. The universe, if you will, imagine it's just this vast field of potentiality. Nothing absolute, but just possibilities. then consciousness comes and organizes that into whatever it wants it to be. It's really rather sad, that from the time we're very young and we start to learn language, we tend more and more in recent years to emphasize the analytical processes. What happened to imagination? What happened to poetry? What happened to music? Children should be allowed to just play. They should be allowed to go out and look at nature and experience it and look at the flowers, look at the birds. And yet we're told, oh, don't worry about that. Or, oh, I had a wonderful dream. Oh, it's just a dream. Don't pay attention to it. It's just your imagination. And it's denigrated. The most creative side of our being is dismissed. And this, I think, is very sad. Maybe it's part of why we have such problems in our culture with young people getting depressed or getting suicidal or feeling stressed. They don't seem to have a sense of meaning, a sense of connection with the world. They don't know how to dream. We have two basic modes. There's a subjective mode of experience that allows us to immerse ourselves in a beautiful sunset, in a concert, in love. And somehow or other we have lost our sense of identity and we have become one. And then there is the analytical side that says, I've got to try to describe this piece of music. I've got to try to describe how I feel about my loved one. But that's the description, isn't the experience. We have to do both. If all we're doing is describing abstract stuff, we're not living. And of course, if all we're doing is experiencing and we're not describing, then we're sort of airheads. But I think it all comes from the same dynamic. What the ancients, the Taoists, called the yin-yang. They're not separate. They're just two ways of perceiving or interacting that come together, and that dynamic is the source of everything that becomes. One of the most important parts of the Pear Lab was the dynamic between Bob and me, yin and yang. We were very different. Bob was very much the scientist, very analytical, very rigorous. I was very much the philosopher, the mythology reader. But we complemented each other. We each brought to the program a different perspective, without which the program never would have happened. We actually wrote a book called Molecular Memories that describes some of this. The energy of the molecule tends to be greater than the sum of the energy of the constituent parts. Neither of us could have done Pear alone, but coming together and sharing that and working together and respecting one another, which is very important. I was the one who interacted more with the participants. I encouraged them. I made them feel at home. I made them feel comfortable. That was important. They were part of our family. Bob was the one that was very scrupulous in checking out the statistics and the analysis and the technology. I think we need both of those. For many millions of years, we didn't separate ourselves from our environment. In order to survive, we became familiar. We resonated with the natural world. We understood the intelligence of the animals. We understood the nature of the changing seasons. I don't think my consciousness is separate from the world. I feel as if I am a part of it. And through that sense of connection, I can have a feeling about what is going on around me. One has to have a sense of connection and belonging to the bigger picture. And this is what we need to learn. We have to go back to some of that early knowledge, some of that intuitive knowledge. We are not only thinking creatures, we're intuitive creatures. There is nobody that I can imagine who doesn't at some point say, I don't feel good about this situation, or this is a very attractive opportunity. What makes it attractive? What makes it not feel good? Is it something intellectual, or is it a gut feeling that makes you be drawn to some situations and wanting to avoid others.
It may just be that beyond the cold, analytical, logical dimensions of the human mind, there is a whole other pattern of softer, intuitive, spiritual capabilities that connect it in this wave mechanical way with a universe that also has its own spiritual wave mechanical dimensions. And it is in that interaction, the spiritual part of human consciousness with the spiritual part of the universe, that these anomalies seem to manifest themselves.
One of the books that we published through our ICRL press is called Syntropy, the Spirit of Love. It postulates that there is a principle called syntropy, which is the complement of the principle we know called entropy. So entropy comes from the past to the present and makes things more and more complex and eventually breaks them down and eliminates them. It becomes chaos. Syntropy comes from the future, from a completed event with the energy that goes back into the present and will draw from the present whatever is needed to fulfill and manifest that completed image. So in a sense, entropy is the spirit of division. Syntropy is the spirit of integration. Again, it's not either or, they're complements. The world consists of this dynamic of things falling apart and things coming together. That is difficult. It is very hard to convince somebody to take on a different worldview. Many years ago, I had this conversation with Bob John. We talked about this, and I said, you know, given human nature, given its greedy, self-serving style of being, how are you ever going to convince these people to love? From the beginning of time, there have been these great teachers who have come along and preached how we should love one another, and you know, what good has it done? And Bob said something I think was very profound. He said, the only way you're going to get people to love one another is when you can persuade them that it's in their own greedy, self-serving best interest to do so. They need to recognize that if they don't do it, they're in deep trouble. You do it because you have to. You do it because it's the only option you've got left. When the despair becomes so great, either you're going to get depressed and end up committing suicide, or you're going to have some kind of a epiphany, some kind of a insight that suddenly, white light, and you go, oh. I remember a story a friend of mine told of her father, who had been a career Marine, this very serious old guy, but he was dying. She was sitting at his bedside, holding his hand. He was asleep. And at one point he opened his eyes and he looked at her very alert and he said, you know what? It's all about love, isn't it? And it has to come like that. You can't tell people that. You can't preach it to them. In my own experience, it was that kind of a thing. I was very depressed. I was a very unhappy young person. I just felt that nothing was going to happen. I had spent my life trying to please other people, and no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't able to please them. They were always critical. And then I had this sudden insight that said, you know, you've got to stop trying to please other people, because even if you do, it's not you that they're going to accept. They're accepting false face that you're putting on, and that's not going to make you happy. Wouldn't you be better off just being who you really are? And then if people don't like you, they don't like you, but the people who do like you really like you. We spend so much of our lives reacting to this terrorizing threat of what will people think. But pleasing somebody by being false is not love. And demanding that somebody behave a certain way so you would love them, that's not love either. Love is being who you are and accepting other people for who they are. How do you get there? I don't know.
John, demoted from dean and shunned by many of his peers, now seems unconcerned about his image. And the fact that science has always rejected anyone who takes psychic research seriously, he takes stoically.
My involvement in this subject has opened for me much broader horizons of understanding and insight than I ever hoped to broach. It has also quite obviously brought me into, in some sectors, into loss of credibility and a certain amount of resistance. I think it was J. Robert Oppenheimer, close to the end of his career, who said that there is no man of goodwill who doesn't desire the approval of his colleagues, and I'm no exception to that. But once again, the ultimate judge of your wisdom and integrity must be the person you see in the mirror.
Over the years, Bob's had attacks from lots of different places. His strength of conviction and integrity with regard to doing this work is such that he's always considered it necessary simply to go on.
There are days when I find the circumstances in our society terrifying. Other days I find it hilariously funny. It's so bad that it's really funny. There's a part of us that is destructive, that wants to break things down and create chaos, and there's a part of us that wants to be drawn together, to be part of a social group, to be in love, to, be part of something bigger. We have to choose which path we're going to follow. They're both there, potentially, and we're all going to have days when we go this way and days when we go that way. But we have to, at some level, we have to choose which path we're going to make a commitment to. What does that? What is it within us that makes us choose which path to follow? I don't know. But I think we do have free will. I think we can choose. I mentioned earlier, I had a very unpleasant childhood, okay? I was not a happy kid. I know people who have had experiences, early experiences, akin to what I had, and they become bitter. They become angry, resentful, and they carry that pain with them all their lives. I didn't. I kind of got out of it and decided this is not a very productive way to go. I'm not hurting anybody but myself. We're not going to be able to love others until we can love ourselves. And we're not taught to love ourselves. We're taught to be critical of ourselves. We're taught to compete. We're taught to live up to other people's, we don't love ourselves. And we're not going to love ourselves until we accept ourselves for who we are and say, hey, it's okay. I may not be perfect, but I'm me. My colleague, Robert John, passed away almost 2 years ago. His brain is no longer functioning, but I feel his presence. I feel his consciousness because we were so close, we worked together, we understood each other. We had such an intense dynamic for so long. I know his consciousness is still there. And there are times when I have a thought and I get a sense of, no, that's not right. And I know it's Bob talking to me. There's a lot of evidence that consciousness is not over just because the body is. And there's no way you're going to convince people who are skeptical of it. And I don't feel the need to try to convince them.
I take personal satisfaction in working on something that has been elusive for so long and appearing to make some progress. And I take some pride at being able to nudge along, however so little, our understanding of these archetypal properties of the human mind. The excitement to me is that for the first time we seem to be on the threshold of demonstrating that property in a coldly scientific format, and thereby the barrier between science and spirit that was artificially erected some century or two ago must crumble and come down. One should be able to do research on spirit.
We are expressions of the life force. We are the manifestation of this dynamic between consciousness and potentiality. The universe wanting to experience itself. There's something precious about being a part of the whole and recognizing that there is a whole. I'm not here all alone. I'm not just here without some purpose or, why am I here? Who am I? What difference does it make? Maybe I should shoot myself. No, I have a purpose to serve, and that is to contribute in whatever way I can to this whole, to be as good a little cell as I can be, because that will enhance the health of the big organism in some way, even though I don't understand it. Where people get into a different state of mind and suddenly they see that everything's really connected. It isn't all separate pieces, it's all one big unit. You just realize that you're just one little piece of the whole, and all of the pieces are connected, and it's beautiful. It gives you such a wonderful, warm feeling of purpose and meaning. It doesn't last very long. You usually come back down to earth, so to speak, and you remember that, you got to go to the grocery store, or you got to go wash the dishes, but it carries back with you some harmony, some piece of that says, I had that experience. I don't have to doubt it. I don't have to worry about somebody else or depend on someone else describing it. I've seen it, I've known it, and I know it's real.